Don't you remember that in the last episode we talked about my poor old GPS that's just sitting in the trunk of my car collecting dust? It's still there. And the problem with that thing was that I have to manually update it, just like I have to manually update my brain. It's not really much automatic update. My mind gets over time. And that's a problem because the roads do change over time. Staying offline is too limiting. We can't use the old to navigate the new. Welcome back to the Joe Wehbe Podcast and the series on how we're wired. I want to talk about phones. Phones, wow. Well, when my parents were young, they lived what we would only be able to refer to as primitive lives. If they wanted to meet up with someone, there was no way of live updating them as to their status and their whereabouts. So they would have to arrange to meet at a certain place and time and not vary from that script. And if something went wrong, there wasn't really a way to figure out how. They were even so primitive, I think at times they didn't even have phones in their own homes, which is pretty weird. I know that if not them, definitely my grandparents' generation did not have phones in their home. It wasn't very common at all. Primitive times. Don't say that to them though. It's not a nice thing to say, but I noticed this changed when I was young. I had to beg, but I think I finally got my first mobile personal phone when I was 11. It could call. It could text, although you had to top up credit. And it had that game Snake on it. And it had a swirly little head, and that was pretty much the coolest thing ever. And fast forward now, well, not even now, that was 2005. And a couple of years after that, everyone had iPhones. Everyone had phones that could also play music and play all these games. You had the App Store. Fast forward to now, what do I use my phone for? I use it to record the video for this podcast. I use it to direct me where I'm going. It enables me to make video face-to-face calls with friends all over the world for free. It also has a sleep timer, which wakes me up at the optimal time when I won't be tired getting up. And for a lot of people, that's probably going to be the most interesting part of this podcast episode. I should almost link that in the show notes. This phone does incredible things. And the gap of time between each big iteration and development with what we can do with our phones gets shorter. In 2005, I was blown away by a swirly top and the game Snake. Now it can run your whole life. So things are changing. We know that. We see that. What only few people appreciate about our world is that it's changing at an increasing rate. And I think the phone is the perfect metaphor for that. Between my generation and my parents' generation, we went from having no phones to having basic phones, mobile phones. Within my lifetime, there have almost been sub-generations indexed by big jumps in the phone technology. And it's reflective of many things. How short was the shelf life of the DVD? When was the last time you had a DVD player? And soon people will listen to this and ask, what on earth is a DVD? So what we need to do is put this in context of the last couple of episodes. We've talked about the war that's been raging for 70,000 years, how the cognitive revolution came in and what it's changed. And it's this gap in our thinking. We've still got astro in the back of our mind, but new, more conscious and self-aware thought in the front of our mind. And we've been talking about this that gap between the thinking, between what most of our brains are designed to do, which is survive as a Homo sapien in a tribe out in the open, that gap between that and the reality we actually live in. The reality we live in has been shaped much more by this neocortex, by this more complicated part of our brain, the part that enables us to build big stories together that we all believe in, and the challenges that come with it. The crucial thing, though, tying all that together, is that the gap between what our brains were designed to do, my rule of thumb for Astro, he's in control of 90% of your brain. The world he was designed to live in and the world we're living in get further and further apart with time as technological innovation compound. Now, if you want to look at history to analyze this, we had the Industrial Revolution, which basically happened, in some semblances from the 17th century, kind of, most dominantly really the start of the 20th century, and just before World War I, and that's when a lot of it came together. And that brought people before then were used to living rurally. Since then, we've come to live a lot more in big cities. But then at the turn of the 21st century, we've had the digital revolution, which changes things a whole lot faster. So how appropriate our brain is getting worse over time. Because remember, we have to manually update it. And that's why when people fear automation and AI and having their jobs being worked out and that rapid change, in many cases, that is the reality. Which is why we need to remain plugged in. So in one respect, it's that to go back to my forgotten road nav, it's not just that we're manually got to plug it in to update it. It's to use that metaphor, the roads change more and more frequently over time. And that's going to keep happening. Technology and the world is going to become a lot more complex. Now, this is a bit of an alarming, maybe, message, and doesn't sound too positive. But all things in perspective, it just brings priority to understanding how we're wired and how to bridge that gap. Now, a good friend of mine wrote a book on psychedelics, for example. Jonathan Kramer, Mind Leap, highly recommend. Very, very well done from a young guy. Holistic view. Psychedelics are one option. The other option, though, I would argue, a lot of the frameworks we discuss on this podcast that I've already written about, most of them on the blog. And these are the tools that are used to negotiate the difference between how we're wired, what the world is like, and thirdly, because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what becomes important for us to still have a good experience while we're here. It's three kind of complicated parts to negotiate together. How do we bridge that gap? Again, this is quite a dense topic, so I did try and keep this short form. So I do apologize if we haven't really extrapolated great value out of that. But maybe I will just finish with the example of the minimum viable lifestyle, for instance. When I talked in the previous episode about the instruction manual for Homo sapiens model, right? How you're recommended to use it, right? Keep it in natural light, keep it in an environment that's green, things like that. So it was a bit of fun. I do have to enjoy myself from time to time. This is why I adore this principle of the minimum viable lifestyle, which was first talked about in episode 001. Because I understand for myself what I need to negotiate in to cope. And as I talked about in the Astro the Dog episodes, you can't neglect the dog, you got to walk the dog. The dog has needs that intellectually, in the front of our brain, we think that they're things that can be a bridge that we can go without, that we don't have to have that balance, that we don't have to walk the dog, that we can just shut it up and stop it from barking, but you can't do that. You have a dog in your brain. You have Astro the dog there. So when you're designing your minimum viable lifestyle, you have to keep Astro in mind. And these are things very tangibly like exercise, just getting out, having some sunshine, getting away from just the mob. And sometimes you need to actually be in touch with things like nature. They trigger things in your body. So the emphasis is just on understanding more and more how we're wired. It gives you better tools to cope. And it doesn't mean you have to give off all the positive things that come with technological change and innovation. For example, we're going to maybe be able to reverse the Industrial Revolution and go back to living more rurally in more natural environments because of technology, because we can work more remotely than ever before. We don't have to be sitting face to face. You're contacting me and I'm contacting you today over audio streaming service or YouTube or some sort of social media site. And these are the things that are changing that are really cool. So lean into them. Close the widening gap. So thank you. There's more on this on the blog post, The Widening Gap, on the website, the blog, www.withjoewehbe.com. Please remember that if you think of anyone that would benefit from this idea, to have a really interesting conversation with them or share the episode with, because after all, the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others. Thank you, and see you next time.